if somebody can misunderstand something in a way that's going to do harm, that is absolutely the way it's going to happen. And I think that's probably what we experience a lot. Like if there is a harmful way of seeing it, it's how they're going to see it. Hey everybody, welcome to the Leader Lab. This is Leadership Shorts, quick thoughts to help you level up your leadership. My name is Chad Wright. I'm the founder of Forward Partners, and I am joined, as always, by my partner in podcasting, Emily Grace Deal. Emily, what are we talking about today?
Well, today we're talking about communication is often cited as the biggest challenge.
All over the place.
Holding teams back. So let's talk about Wiio's law of communication.
Wiio's law of communication. We had a little bit of a, how are we going to pronounce this before we started shooting? It's actually a Finnish researcher. His name is Osmo Wiio, which is the greatest name ever. And this came from an email I got from Jason Fried. He's the CEO of 37 Signals, and he pointed out these laws of communication. I find these so interesting because when we go into organizations, you ask everybody around, hey, what's our biggest challenge? They're always like communication. We're terrible at it. These kind of help us understand why we're terrible at it.
Yeah.
So the first law that this researcher wrote, if communication can fail, it will. And so if there is any possibility that this is going to go wrong, it's going to find a way to go wrong.
Yeah.
And I really think a lot of this is going to speak to how intentional we have to be about how we communicate. Who's the person across from me? You know, what are we in the middle of? What is coloring how we see things and how we communicate?
Right. Taking that extra time to communicate it clear the first time, because you're probably going to have to communicate it again and again and again.
Over and over and over again.
It's going to save you time in the long run.
And what's interesting is every one of those times, if there's a chance it fail, it probably will. His second piece was, if a message can be understood in different ways, it will be understood in just the way which does the most harm. Now, I will say Osmo sounds like a relatively cynical guy. I don't know if this like comes out of his research and he has like data to back this up. It feels like he's probably right, but also a little cynical. Like, if somebody can misunderstand something in a way that's going to do harm, that is absolutely the way it's going to happen. And I think that's probably what we experience a lot. Like, if there is a harmful way of seeing it, it's how they're going to see it. And what I'm wondering here, as we're kind of thinking about this in real time, is how much our fear plays into that. How does that show how often we are communicating based on fear and what it's telling us?
Right. Well, and I think if you err a little on the side of caution, it's probably an easier way. And knowing that someone's fear is going to play into how you're speaking to them is helpful.
Yeah.
Just knowing, like, if I change how I say this a little bit, adjust it, not like I'm speaking to myself, but like I'm speaking to the other person and their fears, then you're probably going to get a better outcome. You're probably going to be able to communicate more clearly. I
think so, because if what he's encountering here is that it's always taken in the way that's the most harmful, I think we don't necessarily realize how often fear is a part of that conversation. So if you and I are having a conversation, there are also two fears attached to that. There's yours, there's mine. And if we can't talk about those, then we're not actually having the conversation we think we are.
Right.
And I think that's where that happens more often than not.
Well, I don't think that means we need to be like, well, I know you're afraid of this, so I'm going to say, because that's just going to like make it worse. Like I'm literally like calling you out. And no one wants their fear on display all the time.
No, but I think it is also like when we know we're going to have a deep conversation, when we know we're going to talk about something really difficult, like when we're doing retreats, when we know we're going to have to spend half a day on some really hard topics that we know are tripping the team up, we always start with personality and communication because we want them to understand what each other's afraid of before we go down that road. Right. And so I think it is understanding if we're going to have a deep, hard conversation, let's start with fear. Let's start with, hey, in this situation, here's what I'm afraid of. Here's how it might change how I see things. Right. And if each person can kind of put that on the table and point to it, now we can really have a conversation knowing all the players at the table, that it's not just the two of us. And I think that's why it goes wrong more often than not, because we never do that, right? The next piece is there's always somebody who knows better than you what you meant by your message. I
feel like that one's my favorite.
That one's really interesting, and I think you see this in email a lot,
yes,
right?
That's what my first thought was.
Yes, it's like, hey, how's your day going? Well, what they meant was, I hate you, and you're a terrible human being. Did they? And so I think being able to understand that we read things into stuff that doesn't exist.
Yes.
Right?
Well, we were talking about this the other day when, like, if you put extra letters on something, like, hey, and there's, like, extra Y's, and you're like, well, what do they mean by those extra
totally
Y's?
Changes me. Listen, you want to really piss me off? put extra exclamation points or extra punctuation of any
Are they
kind.
yelling at me? Are they excited?
Listen, yeah, you throw a question mark and an exclamation point in there, my brain is like, what are we actually saying here? Nothing irritates me more than
Well,
that.
and again, everyone has a different interpretation of it. So if one person is just excited to talk to you, and so they're like
And I'm
telling
like,
you something,
calm down,
and you're
okay?
like, why are you yelling at me?
By the way, if you want to send us emails with way too many punctuation marks, lab@forwardpartners.net. The last one there, the more communication there is, the more difficult it is for communication to succeed. And I think of this from two angles. One, boy, this one's really tough because the reality is we need to communicate things over and over and over and over and over again. And the more that happens, the more difficult it can be because it's a lot of noise and a lot of things happening. So there are really important things we need to communicate repeatedly, and we need to be intentional about that. The other side is the amount of communication that happens. It is so easy for stuff to get lost. And we just flooded, right, between text messages and email and phone calls. Not phone calls as much anymore. I love a good phone call, but most people hate them. But like we just have too much happening. And because of that, it actually makes it really hard to communicate.
You know, the way I interpreted this is like I think about it with my design brain and the fact that like when you design things, right, less is more most of the time because you're trying to send a clear message.
Yes.
So I thought about it in one like mode of communication, making it as clear as possible.
Yes.
So taking out what you can from the email and sending what's the most important.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I was thinking about. But I do like the idea of like too many times is not necessarily a problem as like more at one time.
Your angle on this is really interesting because you're right. It is. Editing is really where the work is, right? It's easy to just write a 17-page email, just here's all the things you need to know.
Right.
But edit that down and say, here's one paragraph, here's two paragraphs. And so that's something like as designers, like that's what you're taught is how to reduce and how to simplify.
Right. Even as much as like how many lines of text can be on one line because we know that people stop reading at a certain point or if it's too long or too bulky. So if you send a 17-paragraph email, no one's going to read that whole thing. They're going to start skimming.
It really occurs to me how much people need to define what it means to be a great communicator, because I think some people will think it's bulk, right? It's the more words the better, but reality is it's the less words. If they are intentional words and they are made to really communicate, to be heard and understood, those are the right words,
right?
Even if there's only 4 of them versus 400 of them,
right? Well, we always talk about like there are some bullet point thinkers and there are some people who want all the information. And the fact is that like, you know, sometimes you can say see the thing for more or like attached thing for more or whatever. We keep talking about email specifically, but I think that's a good piece of it is that everyone does like different amounts of information, but still communicating clearly with that first piece is what's important.
Well, and even when you think about in person, like if it's a 5-minute conversation, that's one thing. If it's a 2-hour conversation, by the end of it, like we're exhausted, we're tired, we're not communicating effectively. This is really interesting. And I think overall what I'm getting out of this is how hard communication really is. It seems like communication is the way old Osmo Wiio here describes it. It really feels like communication is this living creature that is doing its best to fight us and wreck everything we're trying to do. And we're trying to it's like this multi-armed thing that we're trying to get our hands around and wrestle into a helpful form. And so it's really interesting to think about it this way. But I think when we think about this, it also then shows how intentional our communication has to be, which means we got to slow down and we got to consider other people. And I think for me, that's the biggest takeaway is slow down, consider other people, because communication is fighting us, the nature of it, and the nature of the people we're trying to communicate with. So leaders, let's talk next steps. I would just encourage you, think about your communication, about the amount of things you are pushing out there to your team. It is incredibly hard for them to receive what you are actually trying to get them to understand. And so make sure you are slowing down. Make sure you are considering the people on the other side. And when possible, edit. When possible, simplify. Make it cleaner. Make it easier to understand, to make sure they're getting the core of what they need. Because communication, as it is trying to fight you. It is trying to make sure that you are unsuccessful. And so you have to really make sure you are being intentional to overcome that. I love this idea. If anybody wants to send us questions, if they want to send us emails with way too many punctuation marks just to irritate me, where do they send that to?
lab@forwardpartners.net.
lab@forwardpartners.net. If they want to find us online where we're putting out content all the time about healthy leadership, where do they find that?
At Forward Partner.
At Forward Partner. Emily, thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
John, Porchlight Productions, thank you for producing. And thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Please, if this is valuable at all, share this with fellow leaders. Our goal is to impact millions of leaders, and you are a part of that. And so we deeply appreciate you sharing. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you're on a podcast, leave us a review. Let us know how we're doing. We will see you next time right here in the Leader Lab for Leadership Shorts.